Welcome to this edition of News Today, a series where we briefly discuss and analyze important news of the day. Without delay, let's explore the headlines first. New disciplines on good regulatory practice for services trade has entered into force for some World Trade Organization members. India conducted the first human clinical trial of gene therapy for hemophilia A, F8 deficiency, says Ministry of Science and Technology. Reserve Bank of India releases a comprehensive framework for a regulatory sandbox. Global Waste Management Outlook 2024 released at 6th session of United Nations Environment Assembly. United Nations allocates $100 million from Central Emergency Response Fund. World Economic Forum Center for 4th Industrial Revolution inaugurated at Hyderabad. Starting with the first news. New disciplines on good regulatory practice for services trade has entered into force for some World Trade Organization members. The new disciplines on services domestic regulation announced at WTO's 13th Ministerial Conference in Abu Dhabi have been negotiated under the General Agreement on Trade in Services. General Agreement on Trade in Services entered into force in 1995 as a result of Uruguay round negotiations, is a legally binding WTO treaty covering international trade in services. New disciplines aim to ensure that qualification requirements and procedures, technical standards and licensing requirements do not constitute unnecessary barriers to trade in services. Disciplines are binding only on those WTO members who inscribe them into the General Agreement Trade Services schedules. India, although a member of the General Agreement on Trade in Services, is yet to commit to new disciplines. Developing economies that adopt the disciplines can delay the application of specific provisions in sectors where they face implementation difficulties for up to 7 years. If we talk about the significance of the disciplines, then it will reduce trade costs in services with overall savings of $127 billion. Also, it will reduce in-costs of business startup procedures. Moreover, it will ensure broader financial inclusion and will give a boost to participation in global value chains. It also holds several benefits to India as disciplines will be applied on a most favored nation principle and will benefit all WTO members, including India. Further, potential benefits to India include market access, boost in services exports, competitiveness in the global services market, and conducive environment for MSMEs.
Moving on to the next news. India conducted the first human clinical trial of gene therapy for hemophilia A, F8 transgene deficiency, said the Ministry of Science and Technology. This trial involved deploying a novel technology of using a lentiviral vector to express F8 transgene in the patient's hematopoietic stem cell. Hematopoietic stem cells have the capacity to self-renew and the potential to differentiate into all of the mature blood cell types. This trial was conducted by Christian Medical College, Vellore, supported by Department of Biotechnology along with Emory University, USA. Before we start, let us understand about hemophilia. Hemophilia is usually an inherited bleeding disorder in which the blood does not clot properly. It is caused by a mutation or change in one of the genes that provides instructions for making the clotting factor proteins needed to form a blood clot. This disease can further lead to spontaneous bleeding as well as bleeding following injuries or surgery. Coming back, now let us understand about gene therapy. Gene therapy is a technique that modifies a person's genes to particularly treat or cure a disease. It is also a direct way to treat genetic conditions as well as other conditions. Talking about its mechanisms, it is performed by replacing a disease-causing gene with a healthy copy of the gene, inactivating a disease-causing gene that is not functioning properly, and lastly, introducing a new or modified gene into the body. The key gene therapy products are, firstly, plasmid DNA. With this, the circular DNA molecules can be genetically engineered to carry therapeutic genes into human cells. Viral vectors. In this, the gene therapy products that are derived from viruses can be used as vectors or vehicles to carry therapeutic genes. Other products like patient-derived cellular gene therapy products, bacterial vectors, and human gene editing technology. Gene therapy is primarily used for treating genetic disorders like sickle cell disease and also for cancer treatment, for example, CAR T cell therapy.
Moving on to the next news. Reserve Bank of India releases a comprehensive framework for a regulatory sandbox. An inter-regulatory working group set up by the RBI recommended the introduction of a framework for a regulatory sandbox for the fintech sector. Regulatory sandbox refers to live testing of new products or services in a controlled test regulatory environment for which regulators may permit certain regulatory relaxations for testing. It allows field testing of new financial innovations to collect evidence on benefits and risks of new financial innovations. Now let's have a look at the benefits of regulatory sandbox. It will facilitate empirical learning, shaping informed regulatory changes. Benefits also include testing of product viability, enable modifications before broader launch, thus reducing risks. Moreover, it will accelerate financial inclusion through innovations in microfinance, small savings, and digital banking. Lastly, evidence-based decision-making will reduce regulator dependence on industry consultations. Further, apart from benefits, there are also some risks and limitations involved, like possible loss of flexibility and time of innovators in the sandbox process. Case-by-case authorizations and relaxations can involve discretional judgments. Moreover, legal waivers cannot be provided by RBI or its regulatory sandbox. Additionally, post-sandbox testing may also require regulatory approvals for wider application. At last, now let's also discuss and understand the key design aspects of regulatory sandbox. First is regulatory sandbox cohorts, which is based on thematic cohorts focusing on financial inclusion, payments and lending, and digital KYC. Next is regulatory relaxations, as RBI may grant some relaxations such as liquidity requirements, board composition, and statutory restrictions. And lastly, there is exclusion from regulatory sandbox, in which indicative negative list includes credit registry, cryptocurrency, and initial coin offerings.
Moving on to the next news. Global Waste Management Outlook 2024 was released at the 6th session of United Nations Environment Assembly. The Global Waste Management Outlook has been jointly published by the UN Environment Programme and International Solid Waste Association. First, let us talk about the key findings of the report. It was reported that the municipal solid waste generation is predicted to grow from 2.3 billion tons in 2023 to 3.8 billion tons by 2050. Additionally, the global direct cost of waste management was estimated to be $252 billion in 2020, which would almost double by 2050 without urgent action. There are also few barriers that need to be changed in waste management. First of all, the complex problem, which is characterized by multi-layered interdependencies, compound social dynamics, and web of stakeholders. Also, the lack of recognition of urgency with lagging data, underestimation of climate impacts, and underexploitation of mitigation opportunities. The lack of inclusion with non-recognition of gendered aspects of waste and undervaluation of informal sector. The inadequate and ineffective legislations with lack of enabling environment and weak enforcement. And lastly, the persistent market, financial, and technical barriers. Data and digitalization to strengthen the waste management value chain, replication and scaling up of zero waste and circular economy initiatives. Applying producer responsibility fees to prioritize waste reduction and avoid greenwashing. Adopting behavioral science to engage people in waste reduction. And lastly, harnessing the expertise of informal waste workers and women's influence on waste management. Let us also understand about the waste and triple planetary crisis exacerbated by it. The transportation, processing and disposing of waste which generates CO2 and other greenhouse gases and airborne pollutants that contribute to climate change. The biodiversity loss is promoted by the indiscriminate waste disposal practices which can introduce hazardous chemicals into soil, water bodies and the air, further causing long-term and potentially irreversible damage to local flora and fauna, negatively impacting the biodiversity, harming possibly the entire ecosystems, and lastly entering the human food chain. And lastly, between 400,000 and 1 million people die every year because of pollution as a result of diseases related to mismanaged waste that includes diarrhea, malaria, heart disease, and cancer. In our next news, the United Nations has allocated $100 million from Central Emergency Response Fund. This allocated fund will support underfunded aid operations in 7 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and the Latin America. Before we start, let us first understand about the Central Emergency Response Fund. The Central Emergency Response Fund was established by the UN General Assembly in 2005 as the UN Global Emergency Response Fund. It enables humanitarian actors to deliver life-saving assistance to the most vulnerable people when and where needed the most. The Central Emergency Response Fund is managed by the Emergency Relief Coordinator on behalf of the UN Secretary General. It releases its sources for underfunded emergencies twice a year. And lastly, it also serves as a strategic instrument for addressing critical funding gaps in underfunded humanitarian emergencies. Moving on, let us further talk about how the critical funding gaps for the humanitarian emergency projects is widening. For instance, the UN coordinated appeals have met only 60% of their funding requirements over the past decade. That is from 2010 to 20 as reported by Oxfam 2023. Now let us also understand about reasons behind the funding gap. The increase in global conflicts, for example, the Syrian conflict, the rise in the climate-induced natural disasters, that is the drought in Horn of Africa. Another reason includes the polycrisis phenomenon, which means at subnational, national and systematic level risks are compounding, exacerbating the frequency and severity of crisis. Lastly, other reasons include donor fatigue and geopolitical dynamics. Few measures are also required to curb critical funding gap by improving the funding through localized and flexible funding mechanisms, deepening and broadening the funding base by developing new funding tools, and lastly, the coordination between climate and humanitarian finance.
Moving on to the next news. World Economic Forum Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution inaugurated at Hyderabad. The C4IR will be the world's first thematic center which will focus on healthcare and life sciences. The inauguration was done during BioAsia 2024. BioAsia 2024 is the 21st edition of the premier life sciences and healthcare forum in Asia. The World Economic Forum's C4IR initiative is aimed at harnessing the potential of technological progress for equitable and human-centered transformation of industries, economies, and societies. Let us now discuss and understand about Fourth Industrial Revolution or 4IR. 4IR means the digital transformation of the manufacturing industry by technologies such as artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, and Internet of Things. It also refers to smart factories, which are fully connected cyber-physical systems that merge the physical and digital aspects. 4IR was preceded by 3 industrial revolutions. Let's also have a look at them as well. The first industrial revolution emphasized mechanization, steam, and water power. The second industrial revolution focused on mass production and electricity. And third industrial revolution was characterized by electronics and IT and automation. If we talk about the applications of 4IR in healthcare and life sciences, then these include monitoring, recording, visualization, and sharing of symptoms using wearable devices, evidence-based care through health profiling and clinical registries, and facilitating precision medicine and targeted drug delivery. Further, it also poses some challenges like fragmented and siloed patient information, lack of skilled personnel, privacy concerns, security issues due to cyber challenges, and ethical issues. Earlier, C4IR India Center was also established in Maharashtra. It is coordinated by Niti Aayog.
The place in news for today is Japan with its capital Tokyo. It is in news recently as Japan has started the 4th discharge of nuclear contaminated water despite the backlash. Talking about its political boundaries, it is an island country lying off east coast of Asia. It stretches from Sea of Okhotsk in the north to East China Sea in the south. The 4 main islands from north to south are Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, with Honshu being the largest among them. Its maritime borders are the People's Republic of China, North Korea, South Korea, Philippines, Russia, Northern Mariana Islands, and Republic of China. Talking about its geographical features, it is located at the Circum-Pacific Belt, also known as the Ring of Fire. Its highest mountain is Mount Fuji, and lastly, its longest river is the Shinano River.
As we conclude today's main news, let's go through some quick updates. The US Chamber of Commerce released 12th edition of its International Intellectual Property Index. Top countries on the index are the USA, UK, and France. India's position remained unchanged at 42 out of 55 economies. The Intellectual Property Index is different from the Global Innovation Index. It ranks India at 40th position out of 132 economies. The RBI issued draft guidelines on the Disclosure Framework on Climate-Related Financial Risks 2024. If we talk about its objective, regulated entities should disclose information about their climate-related financial risks and opportunities for the users of financial statements. The Reserve Bank of India warned users against charging mobile phones using public ports amidst the rising incidence of juice jacking. Juice jacking is a form of cyber attack where hackers load malware with public USB charging stations to maliciously access electronic devices. It can lock a device, export personal data and passwords to the cyber criminals. First ever Herpet faunal survey has been conducted in the core area of the Mudumalai Tiger Reserve. Mudumalai Tiger Reserve is located in Tamil Nadu. It has a common boundary with Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary, Kerala on the west, Bandipur Tiger Reserve, Karnataka on the north. It is part of Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, which is the first biosphere reserve established in 1986 in India. The Prime Minister launched India's first indigenous green hydrogen fuel cell inland waterway vessel under the Harit Nauka initiative. It is manufactured by Cochin Shipyard. Harit Nauka Green Transition Guidelines for Inland Vessels has been launched by the Ministry of Ports, Shipping and Waterways. Calcutta High Court held that differentiating between contractual and permanent employees for the purpose of extending maternity leave is impermissible as it violates Article 14 and Maternity Benefit Act 1961. The Act provides paid maternity leave to women workers. The World Health Organization has released an update on measles. Measles is a highly contagious disease caused by a virus. It can affect anyone but is most common in children. It infects the respiratory tract and then spreads throughout the body. Humans are the only natural hosts of measles virus. It is covered under the Universal Immunization Program of India. Researchers have found an entire new class of viroid-like life forms in the human gut. They call them obelisks. They are named after the highly symmetrical, rod-like structures found by twisted lengths of RNA. Their ability to code for proteins makes them different from viroids. Viroids are plant pathogens consisting of circular, single-stranded RNA without the protein code that is typical for viruses. Before we go, it's time to put your knowledge to test in today's segment of Test Your Learning. Thank you for joining us. We hope you have enjoyed this edition of News Today. To get the answers to today's quiz and to download the PDF of News Today, make sure to check out the links in the description below.